Hi, this is Wes Fryer, and it is August the 19th, 2019. This past Sunday in our class, we were watching an amazing video about the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf contrasted to the Red Sea, and it was talking about the dust and sands of time and how those flowed out of Mesopotamia. And so we mentioned Eden, and we're going to be talking a little bit about ideas about creation. And so that reminded me of this fantastic book by Toby Lester called The Fourth Part of the World. And I read this a number of years ago, and it's the story of the Waldseemüller map, which is the most expensive thing the Library of Congress ever purchased. And it was the first map to actually show the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, surrounded by water entirely. It was based, the map was on the voyages of Amerigo Vespucci, and so it is really an amazing combination of geography and history and worldview, religion, the perspectives of those that were drawing maps throughout time. And I was just reminded of that because there's a section in here that talks about Eden and how explorers who came to what was referred to as the New World believed they had discovered it. And so I just thought I would read some excerpts of that and share that part of this book. So this is beginning on page 290. And so I'll just read this. It says, "It was a prophetic guess. Columbus and his men had reached the coast of South America, specifically the delta of the great Orinoco River, which spills out from modern-day Venezuela into a gulf still known today as the Gulf of Paria. But just 4 days later, on August 17th, Columbus changed his mind. He hadn't found a new continent, he decided. He had found the oldest one of them all. He had reached the outskirts of the earthly paradise." Columbus had read extensively about the earthly paradise by the time he made his third voyage. Along with Ophir and Tarshish, it formed a central part of his spiritual map of the East. Much of what he knew about the place came from Pierre d'Ailly. "The earthly paradise is a pleasant spot," d'Ailly had written in The Image of the World, in a passage that Columbus marked up enthusiastically. "Located in certain regions of the East that are separated by land and sea from our inhabited world, it is so high up that it abuts on the sphere of the moon, and the waters that descend from this very high mountain form a vast lake. It is said that these falling waters are so noisy that they make inhabitants of the region deaf. From this lake flow the four rivers of paradise, the Pishon, that is, the Ganges, the Gihon, which is no other than the Nile, and the Tigris and the Euphrates. All of the great Christian authorities, among them St. Augustine, the Venerable Bede, Isidore of Seville, and Thomas Aquinas, had left behind similar descriptions, and in the 14th century the English Benedictine Ranulph Higden had distilled their conclusions in his Polychronicon, or Universal Chronicle, a popular work first printed in 1482, just when Columbus was beginning to immerse himself in his studies. But Higden, writing after Europeans had begun to explore Asia, also described the earthly paradise with a new kind of geographic specificity. And I wrote in my little headline here, the utter East, which C.S. Lewis talks about in the Chronicles of Narnia. This reminded me of that, and may have been inspiration for what Lewis, of course, he was writing a religious allegory in the Chronicles of Narnia. Quote, "The learned conclude," end quote, he wrote, "that the earthly paradise is located in the farthest east and makes up a sizable part of the earth's mass, being no smaller than India or Egypt, for the place had been intended for the whole of the human race if man had not sinned." By Columbus's time, this was the reigning view. The earthly paradise was a real place in the world, and therefore could be located with precision by travelers and geographers. There was the memorable account of Sir John Mandeville, of course, which Columbus knew well, but by the 15th century, even mathematical geographers were getting into the act. One authoritative table of geographical coordinates, for example, put the earthly paradise at the top of its list of the world's places and assigned it a latitude of 0 degrees, the center of the earth, and a longitude of 180, as far away as geometrically possible from where the West, quote, began. Columbus is often ridiculed for having decided in the Gulf of Paria that he had reached the outskirts of the earthly paradise. But given the geographical information he had to work with, his conclusion had a certain logic to it. He had reached a giant continent at the very end of the east, near the equator, And there he had found an agreeable climate, gentle breezes, trees that produce wonderful fruits and fragrances, a giant land, and a vast freshwater lake fed by 4 great rivers. He had discovered something else too, a mysterious shift in his compass readings at the 100-league mark. Was the normal shift in magnetic variation that takes place as one crosses the Atlantic, caused by the fact that the world's physical and magnetic north poles don't coincide. The geometrical point around which the Earth turns is not exactly the same as where a compass points. But Columbus didn't know that. In his mind, this shift had a powerful significance, which he explained in a rambling letter that he wrote to the sovereigns on October 18th, 1498. I have always read that the world, both land and water, was spherical, as the authority and researches of Ptolemy and all the others who have written on this subject demonstrate and prove, as do the eclipses of the moon and other experiments that are made from east to west, and the elevation of the North Star from north to south. But I have seen this discrepancy, magnetic variation, as I have said. I am compelled, therefore, to come to this view of the world. I have found that it does not have the kind of sphericity described by the authorities, but that it has the shape of a pear, which is all very round except at the stem, which is rather prominent, or, that is, as if one had a very round ball on one part of which something like a woman's teat was placed. This part with the stem nearest to the sky, lying below the equinoctial line in this ocean sea at the end of the east. I mean by the end of the east, the point where its land and islands terminate. To confirm all this, I cite all the arguments written above the line that passes from the north to south 100 leagues west of the Azores. For, in crossing this to the westward, the vessels keep rising gradually toward the sky and then enjoy milder weather. This passage has opened Columbus up to even more ridicule than his claim to have reached the vicinity of the earthly paradise. But once again, in making this conclusion, he wasn't actually straying far from the cosmological ideas that were already in the air. In the Divine Comedy, for example, Dante put the earthly paradise on top of what he called Mount Purgatory, which he placed on the equator at the beginning of the east, exactly halfway around the globe from Jerusalem. Dante's world, in other words, was pear-shaped, just like Columbus's. Some copies of the Divine Comedy that circulated during Columbus's lifetime even contained illustrations that gave this idea visual form. Did Columbus have some such illustration in mind when he proposed his pear-shaped world? It's at least possible, given that Columbus read cosmological works voraciously, sold printed books imported from Italy, and had access to Spain's great Franciscan libraries. What's very clear, at least, is that by the time of his third voyage, Columbus understood the earthly paradise as a real place of great symbolic power, located at the 0 point of space and time. The earthly paradise was where history and geography had begun, and it was where they both would come to an end, as the influential theologian and Mappamundi maker Hugh of St. Victor had written at the end of the 12th century. The order of space and the order of time seem to be in almost complete correspondence. Therefore, divine providence's arrangement seems to have been that what was brought about at the beginning of time would also have been brought about in the east at the beginning, so to speak, of the world as space. And then as time proceeded toward its end, the center of events would have shifted to the west, so that we may recognize out of this that the world nears its end in time as the course of events has already reached the extremity of the world in space. By crossing the ocean, connecting east and west, and locating the outskirts of the earthly paradise, Columbus was helping bring about the end of the world. And so here at the top of this page, which is page 293, we see figure 61, the pear-shaped world as Columbus might have seen it illustrated from Dante's Divine Comedy, published in 1506. Jerusalem and the Inferno are at the top, Europe and Africa on the left, Asia is on the right, and at the bottom is Mount Purgatory, on top of which Dante located the earthly paradise. So this idea of Eden, of the earthly paradise, of the place where all these rivers converged, and the belief that folks had back in the early 1500s that Eden was a physical location, and it could be found, it could be mapped, and I just think it's fascinating how all of those beliefs were shaping thought at that time, and also, of course, influenced the way that maps were drawn and the worldview that people had. Of course, that perspective would change dramatically with the passage of time and the advances in technology and our ability now to see our planet from space.